Okay, we'll start then. Colleagues, today I'm going to be talking about collective bargaining and in particular how to prepare a pay claim with the idea of giving some tips for negotiators, perhaps one or two people representing trade unions who are new to the act of pay bargaining. So I'm going to tell you a little bit from my experience helping trade unions in Britain in terms of how to prepare a pay claim. This is based on more than 20 years experience where I was actively helping the national negotiators in the United Kingdom, mostly in the UK car industry, which has been well unionised for very many years, and the pay negotiations in the UK car industry are often quoted as the leading pay negotiations inside the United Kingdom. My role was to help the negotiators to frame the economic arguments for their particular pay claim. So I was there to provide the evidence and the analysis to support their pay claims, and it's that I'm going to be talking about and illustrating this afternoon. I did it in a small research unit which was set up at Ruskin College in 1971 called the Trade Union Research Unit, and what we were tasked with doing was providing academic support in terms of economic analysis to trade unions who wanted to negotiate more effectively with their various employers, and we did that for the best part of the next 40 years. We started off in 1971 with a pay claim that we prepared for the trade unions at Ford, the American multinational, who are a major car producer and engine producer at the time anyway in the UK. Now of course they produce engines in the UK, no longer cars. And the pay claim that we produced in 1971 was recognised as a bit of a game changer because it was based on hard academic analysis of Ford's profitability and their company performance. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like that before, and the trade union negotiators were given a very powerful set of arguments to present both to the company and to their members about what the company should be paying by way of a pay increase to the workforce in that particular year. One of the other things that's worth mentioning here, particularly for new negotiators, is where you've got a strong set of arguments, it's a good idea to condense those arguments into a leaflet and to issue that to the workforce at the same time as you begin your negotiations. That means the workforce are fully aware of the main arguments that are being used by their negotiators to try and get an increase in their particular pay. We did that in successive years when we negotiated with Ford, and we also did it for various of the other British car manufacturers, and it always worked very well. It's a good idea for the membership to be kept informed as to what the key arguments are that are being used on their behalf to actually try and win pay increases or improvements in terms and conditions. In order to do that, we developed a model, analytical model, which I'm going to go through with you in a minute, which supports the negotiation process. Before I go into it, I would like to stress the importance of information disclosure. If you're trying to make a sound economic argument, then you do need the information in order to provide the analysis on which you can base those arguments. And that's not always forthcoming. Company accounts are notorious for what they hide as well as what they reveal. And one of the lessons that we learned fairly early on at Ford, being part of an American multinational, is that it becomes very easy for an American multinational to hide profits in one country as against another country. And we had to find ways around that. So in the end, we became familiar with the American Ford US accounts and the German Ford US accounts, but also we had a separate information agreement between the negotiators and the company, which allowed the negotiators, before they started negotiating, to actually ask a series of questions requesting specific information. Over the years, Ford revealed more and more information about their company performance, about their hours of work, which provided the negotiators with much stronger arguments and much stronger information. So if you have to rely on company accounts, then you need to know where to look, and you need to know the dangers of using company accounts. If you can organise an information agreement which enables you to ask specific questions about the particular company operation that you're dealing with, then that's the best approach to take. So I'd strongly urge new negotiators to think about information disclosure agreements with the companies that they're negotiating with. It may be that you are in a country where legislation is helpful. Legislation might provide you with the opportunity to actually access some information, but that's not always the case. If you can negotiate an agreement for information disclosure, so much the better. There are good models for this, and this is one of the things that we'll make sure is available to you, a copy of the information agreement that Ford did in the UK with their negotiators, which is a very good place to start. The other area which can be used as an information disclosure agreement, again from the UK, from our Arbitration Conciliation Advisory Service, which we call ACAS, they have a code of practice on disclosure of information, the sort of information that should be disclosed to assist responsible and effective collective bargaining. So the ACAS code of practice on information disclosure, which is available online, is actually a very good place to start if you want to frame an information disclosure agreement. The reason why company bargaining became important was because the UK moved away from sectoral agreements, moved away from multi-employer bargaining during the 1950s and 1960s. Throughout the Second World War and the early part of the post-war period, UK manufacturing was often covered by what we call sectoral agreements. So, for example, we had the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Union, who were negotiating on behalf of a whole range of companies. We had the Coventry Tool Room Agreement, which came out of the dominance of that particular city, Coventry, its dominance of engineering and metalworking. The skilled workers in that city set the standards for skilled engineering workers elsewhere in the country. That became known as the Coventry Tool Room Agreement. But in the 1960s, companies like Ford, or led by Ford, broke away from that type of multi-employer bargaining because they wanted to be able to pay more. They wanted to be able to recruit scarce skilled workers and, more importantly, to retain them. So Ford, very early on in the late on in the 1960s, broke away and set up company level bargaining. It didn't take long before other major manufacturing companies followed suit, and over the next 10 or 15 years, multi-employer bargaining sectoral agreements literally withered away, and company level agreements became the dominant form in the manufacturing sector, and certainly in the auto industry. Now, once you move to company level agreements, as a negotiator, it becomes very important that you understand that particular company that you're working with. You understand its economic viability, you understand its performance, you understand what its future prospects are like. So you need to understand its market, you need to understand the investment strategies, and so on and so forth. And very often trade union negotiators who are working with one particular company very quickly become familiar with these things. But as a negotiator, you do need to be familiar with the performance of the company, and that means you do need to understand how does the company measure its economic performance, where it publishes it, and how you understand it and interpret it, as well as various other things which are important in framing a pay claim, which we'll come to in a minute. So, if we're thinking about how do we prepare a pay claim, what do we base the pay claim on, what are the key arguments? What are the pillars, if you like, of a pay claim? This is the model that we developed at Ruskin, and I think this is a model that is universal. It can apply to any company in any particular country. It's a bit more difficult in the public sector, but not impossible. But certainly in the private sector, this is a model that works. So at the heart of it are the documentations that can be produced for the negotiators. So in other words, the negotiators will go into negotiations with some paperwork, or perhaps even with a PowerPoint presentation. In the last few years, I know the negotiators I've worked with actually produced their pay claim and showed it as a PowerPoint presentation to the managers that they were negotiating with. So you need some documentation, you need paperwork. Okay, what goes into that paperwork? We say there are 4 basic pillars that make up the claims documents. The first thing that we look at is inflation. If you're dealing with a workforce who had a pay agreement a year ago and prices have increased since that time by 5%, then the purchasing power of those workers has decreased by 5%. So obviously, as a negotiator, the first thing you want to try and do is to restore the purchasing power of your members. So your first measurement, if you like, is inflation. What's happened to inflation? Now, as well as restoring the purchasing power, if you're in a situation where you expect inflation to continue rising, say by 3 or 4% over the next 12 months, you try and, if you like, preempt that affecting the purchasing power of your members by also considering that. So 5% restores their purchasing power. If we add another 3 or 4%, that in fact offsets the inflation that we expect to come through in the next 12 months. So on that example, we would be thinking about a pay increase of around about 7%. That would both restore purchasing power and protect that purchasing power against future inflation. So that might be our first benchmark, 7%. How do we justify 7%? Can we justify 7%? Can the company afford to pay 7%? Before we go into that, let me just also say this also relies upon access to inflation data. Most governments measure the cost of living, and most governments will publish the cost of living. There are various ways in which these indices, these cost of living indices, are produced and published. For example, in the UK, we have 2 formulas, one which we call the Retail Price Index and one which we call the Consumer Price Index, which is a European Union standard index. Sadly, the Retail Price Index calculation is always a bit higher than the CPI calculation. So negotiators on the union side will always say, we want the RPI increase. The managers will always say, no, we want the CPI increase because it's a lower one. So you have to get that sorted out before you start. Which index are we going to use? In the car industry, in fairness to management, they used the RPI throughout all the time I was helping the negotiators. But you need to look at how inflation is measured in your particular country and make sure that you have access to these indices, because that tells you how much the cost of living has changed since you last negotiated. Okay, now the other thing obviously which as a negotiator you're interested in is how do the terms and conditions and the pay of the members in this company that I'm interested in compare with other companies in the same industry. Are they better paid or are they worse paid? Are their conditions of service better or not as good? So also we look at other companies. So for example, if we were preparing arguments about Ford, we would look at the pay and conditions of Jaguar workers. We would look at the pay and conditions of Peugeot workers. We would look at the pay and conditions of Rover workers. We'd look at the pay and conditions of Land Rover. and we'd see which of those companies made the best pay agreements and offered the best conditions. And we'd always use that as a comparator and say, we want to be as good as the best conditions in the industry. The best conditions are Jaguar, for example. And for many years that was true. Jaguar had the best pay, and their other terms and conditions were also very good. So Jaguar was a bit of a benchmark. So as a negotiator, you're interested in company X, but you also want to know the other companies, the other competitors in that industry, how do they pay their workers and what are their terms and conditions like? Because that all helps to support your negotiations. Perhaps the most important part is this ability to pay. Can the company afford, in our example, a 7% pay increase? What's happened to its profits over the last couple of years? Now, if its profitability is showing robust growth, let's suppose its profits have grown by 10% since we last negotiated, then you can safely say that here's a company that's actually outperforming inflation. So it's a company that's actually probably has enough money in its coffers in order to meet this type of pay claim. What's its future like? What are the experts saying about this company? Is it strong? Is it robust? Is it investing for the future? How is the market moving? Is this a company that the market likes, that its products are selling well? So this is all information which you have to gather in order to understand the ability to pay. But the most crucial line here really is the profitability of the company. Now, the important point to bear in mind here is that profitability in a set of company accounts is expressed in a number of ways. From a negotiator's point of view, the profit that we're interested in is the operating profit. The operating profit is the profit level which the company's executives also look at when they want to judge, are we doing well or are we doing badly? Often in negotiations, the trade union negotiators will be directed to the very bottom line profit, the profit after tax, after interest has been deducted, and after the shareholders have been paid their dividend. The bottom line after tax profit. That's where the management will want to take the negotiations. As a trade union negotiator, you say no to that. We want to be operating at the operating profit level before the taxman takes his cut, before the banks take their interest, and before the shareholders get their dividends. In other words, get the workers to the top of the queue. Make sure the workers are being considered against the operating profit level. I can't stress that enough. It's very, very important indeed. It's there in most published accounts. Now, you might well be in a country where multinational companies are operating. They will produce accounts in your particular country. They may not conform to some of the standards that we've seen elsewhere in Western Europe, but there will be some reference to profitability. You can check this with an information agreement. These are the sorts of questions you can be putting in to support your negotiations. What is the operating profit for your company's operations in my country? If all else fails, if it's an American multinational, you can go online to the Stock Exchange, Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, and pull up the annual returns that the American multinationals are forced to put into the American government. They are very, very comprehensive, and with a little bit of fortitude, because there's usually a lot of pages there, you can probably find some of the information that you'll need for your particular country and your particular operation. I often used to search American accounts for Ford UK negotiations, so it can be done. Also, we need to think about productivity. We need to think, as well as profitability, how about the increase in value added, the increase in physical output that might be coming through. And if we're in a situation where a company over the last year has developed a greater output, according to what it's making, with much the same level of workforce, then we can assume from that that the productivity attributable to the worker has actually increased. So again, this is information that normally you can get some idea of from the accounts, if it's a physical output and you know the number of workers. But it's usually the sort of thing that you might want to ask additional questions of the company, because they may measure productivity in a whole host of ways. But what you need to understand is, what's the trend in productivity? Is it increasing? Are the efforts of our members increasing the output of this company, or increasing the value of the output of this company? If that can be established, then again, this helps to support the argument for a significant pay claim. So just to recap, all these things have a bearing on the overall claim documentation. The first point about inflation, that's your first stake in the ground. That's where you work out, what do we need by way of an increase in order to restore purchasing power and to protect purchasing power against future inflation. So that's the first place to go. And then we start to look at all these other elements, these three other pillars. Again, I would stress this, the importance of an information agreement, particularly to support your arguments around profitability and market performance. Also about productivity. These are not necessarily measurements that you will see in a set of company accounts. You might need to dig, and an information agreement will help you to dig. It's all interlinked, as you can see. And as also you can see here, on the left-hand side of the diagram, the inflation and the comparative terms and conditions, that's external data, that's external to the company. On the other side, on the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see it's internal data. This is information that's within the company, and it's information that the company should be disclosing to you in order to ensure that the negotiations are well informed and are responsible, that they're not based on wild speculation, they're based on evidence, and they're based on as much fact as we can gather. So right-hand side, internal data, left-hand side, external data. And that external data, to some extent, depends both upon governments, how well they produce inflation information and how accessible it is, and on the other side, how good is the comparative information? Do you have organisations that collect together evidence of other terms and conditions? And you might be lucky, you might have access to the wage indicator online, for example, and the wage indicator online will enable you and help you to actually look at comparative terms and conditions in your industry. So that's something to bear in mind very strongly. When I was carrying out this analysis, we didn't have the benefits of wage indicator. I wish we did. Another thing that's incredibly important in terms of the credibility of the claim is to be able to cost what it would be to meet the claim in full. In other words, let's suppose we go with our example and we say to the company, we want a 7% increase in pay across the board for all our members. The first thing the company will say in response is, if we meet that in full, you will bankrupt the company and all your members will lose their jobs. That is the standard response of managerial negotiators. Now you can preempt that by working out, well, what would it cost to meet this 7% claim? Again, we need to have some information here. We need to know what's the size of the wage bill of the workforce involved. You can get some information, wages and salaries, labour costs are listed usually in the notes to the published accounts. So we can get some idea, broadly speaking, of the cost of labour. Also, published accounts will show you the overall costs of the organisation. Now, very often, particularly in a company producing cars, labour is quite a small part of the overall cost basis. These are companies that are capital intensive. They require a lot of capital equipment to do much of the work, and labour is quite a small component. Again, if you looked at the docks, for example, now, you'd find that labour is a very, very small part of the overall cost of running a modern docks operation. It's the capital equipment that costs all the money. So, if labour is a relatively small part of the overall cost, it follows that actually adding to a very small part of the overall cost really doesn't affect the overall cost of the organisation very much. So you need to know what proportion of overall costs are accounted for by labour, and you can get that, as I say, a crude idea of it from the published company accounts, but it's the sort of thing that we would very specifically ask in the information disclosure. In other words, give us the details of the pay bill, give us the details of the overall cost of the organisation, and then we can work out what it would cost to meet our particular claim. Just to give you an example, General Motors, who make cars that are called or branded Vauxhall in the UK, is probably the most capital intensive of the car manufacturers in the UK. Unions used to say it was a screwdriver operation. In other words, they just screwed together the parts and nothing else. Labour costs were about 8% of the overall costs of General Motors operations in the total of the UK. Now, you can add quite a lot to 8% without really affecting the overall costs of the business. So our 7% pay claim added onto the labour costs is not going to make very much difference to overall costs. Probably around 1% with all the various add-ons. Now that's not going to bankrupt the company. And if we have that information and we can make that argument, we can convince our members that we're not going to kill the company, and we can put that information and we can put that message out to the media, who are often very interested in pay negotiations. And we can make the union look very responsible, rather than an irresponsible outfit that's actually making outrageous pay claims. No, we're actually making a carefully costed pay claim that will not add very much to the overall cost of this business. So costing the claim, very, very important indeed. Believe me, it boosts the confidence of the workforce if they know that. When I talked about the leaflet and making sure the workforce understand the arguments, this is one of those crucial points. Certainly when Ford were negotiating a few years ago and there was a dispute, a strike at the end of it, I well remember the British media, very hostile to trade unions at the time, interviewing workers as they were leaving strike meetings in Liverpool and in Dagenham, and expecting the workers to make outrageous claims in answers to their questions. Why are you in dispute with Ford, etc. And I was listening to it on the radio. The workers, all of them, were quoting the leaflet. They were quoting the arguments that we'd developed and we'd given to their negotiators. And they were very reasonably saying, Ford actually is very profitable. Ford UK has been lending money, over £1 billion, to Ford of the US. Ford of the US are paying money back to us. That would pay our pay increase. That was in fact the case in this particular set of negotiations. So the workers themselves were very confident, they had the facts, and they were able to articulate those facts such that this was then a dispute that the media could not portray as wild militancy. It was well argued, well constructed, and well understood. Okay, just briefly to finish off by talking about the advantages and disadvantages of company level bargaining, because this varies from industry to industry and it varies from country to country. But in developed countries where decentralized bargaining, company level bargaining, has become the trend, then we need to think about some of the advantages. One of the things, and I think I've tried to stress this in what I've been saying, is that it does enable pay and conditions to be more closely aligned with profitability and productivity. One of the problems, and Ford were a good example of it, of multi-employer bargaining, is that multi-employer bargaining tends to set its standards at the level of the weakest member. Now, Ford didn't want that. They wanted to set their standards higher because they needed to attract and retain skilled workers. So company level bargaining enables negotiators to align pay and conditions with the profitability, the viability, the dynamism of the particular company that they're dealing with. You don't get that with multi-employer bargaining. The other thing, and I've already, I think, hinted about this, it does bring the negotiations and the negotiators much closer to the membership. It means that the individual workers have knowledge of what is being negotiated, what the arguments are, who is negotiating on their behalf. I remember once talking to a group of agricultural workers in the United Kingdom who we'd prepared the pay claim for them. This was in the early 1970s. They had some of the best arguments for a pay increase I've ever seen. They were hugely productive, they were very underpaid, and their future productivity was obviously on the increase as well. And in other respects, lots of their terms and conditions were very poor and very inferior. So they had a very, very good case for pay improvement. I spoke to a group of such workers about their pay claim, about the negotiations, about the arguments that we put forward. And I discovered, to my horror, that their negotiators, these were national level negotiations done through an agricultural wages board, that their negotiators never shared any of the information that they had, never shared the terms of the conditions comparisons, never shared the productivity and profitability figures that we'd given them with their ordinary workers, or indeed with their shop stewards and conveners. So the frontline troops in the agricultural workers sector at that time did not know the power of the arguments that their negotiators were using. They were completely disconnected because the negotiators wanted to keep everything very close to their chest. In my view, that's tactically and strategically wrong. I actually think it's probably immoral as well. So company level bargaining enables much greater communication between negotiator and workforce and closes up the gap between negotiator and workforce. That's important if you want support. If the negotiators need to be able to call on the workforce to demonstrate their support for negotiations, then they need to know what those negotiations are about and what the arguments are that are being deployed on their behalf. If it comes to militant action, if the workforce feel that they have some ownership of the pay negotiations because they are familiar with the argument, they're more likely to be supportive of and demonstrative of industrial action, call it what you will, in order to put pressure on the employer to pay. It's easier if you've got that sort of connection. You also find, as we found in the car industry, that a powerful company emerges as a wage leader. So Ford emerged as a wage leader in the 1970s and 1980s. And other negotiators could actually see what was achieved at Ford and could then use that to actually help pitch their own negotiations. So again, it enables you to use a strong company to help support perhaps some weaker companies and the negotiators in that. I also think operating at company level enables negotiators to perhaps widen the traditional bargaining agendas, move beyond simply pay into other interesting areas of training, of health and safety, and so on and so forth. And we have many examples from the UK, possibly the best one, a deal done in 1988, the Ford Employee Development Assistance Program, which in a very short period of time, 3 or 4 years, was involving somewhere in the region of 25 or 30% of the workforce in education and training, which was requested by the workforce, not by the company, but by the workforce, enabling the workforce to actually develop themselves, their education or their skills, at the company's expense. The company paid £200 per head to enable that to happen, often on the company premises, after the shift, into the classroom. That was happening at Dagenham, at Halewood, and various Ford plants around the country, and was enormously successful. Now that was a creative bit of bargaining by a couple of very creative trade union negotiators. Taken up, one has to say, by senior managers who also began to see the benefits of that type of endeavour. And it didn't cost Ford very much at the time. The benefits in terms of industrial relations improvements and an improved and a more studious workforce were very strong indeed. The downside of company level bargaining, to some extent, is the reverse of what I've been talking about. The lack of company information. Companies hold all the cards when it comes to actually holding the crucial information, and very often they're reluctant to divulge it, particularly if it strengthens the hands of the trade union negotiators. So you do need to develop some relationships and to develop some information agreements to get reluctant companies to disclose. You might need to go to the courts in order to use legislation to lever some information out of particular companies. That happens on occasion. Also, you'd have to say that company level bargaining does fit the neoliberal agenda. If we're trying to move away from that to a more planned approach, to a more mixed economy, if we're trying to actually use wage determination to improve the lot of the lower paid, then company level bargaining is possibly not the most effective way to do that, whereas multi-employer bargaining, I can see, does do that. Perhaps more significantly, though, is that it enables unscrupulous managers to play a divide and rule game. So again, if we take a multinational company like Ford were very good at threatening UK negotiators by using Ford in Germany as an example, saying Ford in Germany was more productive, Ford in Germany had better labour relations, Ford in Germany are more profitable, and that unless you buck your ideas up in Ford UK, we won't be investing in you in the future. Now, that sort of playing one country off against another also sometimes happens between plants, one plant played off against another. We know it happens, and the best way to deal with it is to actually make sure that the countries involved, that the unions are talking to each other, and that they have the proper information. One of the things which actually stopped Ford in the UK from doing that was when a senior executive from Ford Germany was appointed senior executive in Ford UK. And that senior executive who'd spent his life in Ford Germany suddenly started to make public certain statements, such as, well, I expected Ford UK not to be as good as Ford Germany, but I was wrong. Ford UK is every bit as productive. The workforce is every bit as good as Ford Germany. So the truth emerged eventually, and that helped stop the playing off and playing the divide and rule game. But that is one of the downsides of company level bargaining. Also, it means that when times are tough, and times often get tough in this modern economy, companies will come and demand concessions of trade unions, and often trade unions are fighting a bitter rearguard battle to try and hold the terms and conditions without making too many concessions. But company level bargaining enables that sort of isolation to take place. The other thing, of course, thinking of a European perspective, although we have European Works Councils, there isn't very much coordination of pay negotiations or terms and conditions negotiations across countries, even though we may be dealing with the same company. So the European Works Councils haven't changed very much. Ford were one of the companies that actually actively campaigned to try and prevent European Works Councils from becoming involved in negotiations, and they were successful. And much earlier, Ford had led a campaign against a European Union proposal which would have obliged multinationals to disclose much more financial information to trade unions. Again, Ford led the charge against that in Europe and were mostly successful in frustrating that. So we do know that multinational companies at the moment have managed to avoid international bargaining arrangements. And that is something, obviously, which trade unions have to work at and work towards in the future. Company level bargaining certainly is an advantage where you've got companies that are doing well. You can make sure that the workforce share in their economic prosperity. There isn't a great deal of evidence that that exerts much of an upward pull on weaker companies. Maybe a little bit. But we still have to separately look at weaker performers and try and do appropriate negotiations with weaker performers to make sure they gradually come up to the standards of the best. So, just looking at those final thoughts, the ones that I suppose I'd like to highlight is that we could actually integrate pay negotiations in multinational companies across borders. It might be quite difficult to integrate pay negotiations because we have different taxation systems even in the European Union. But what you could do is to ensure that working time, for example, or access to training or access to education was harmonised across the piece. One of the things that always upset me was to see how many more hours in a year a Ford worker in Liverpool was working on the same model as a Ford worker in Germany, who was working many, many hours less in a year, simply because of the way in which the collective agreements in Germany and in the UK had actually agreed working time, and in particular holiday time. And we actually calculated, and Ford didn't ever disagree with us, that in the UK, a Liverpool Ford worker was working on average an extra 20 days a year compared to his exact counterpart in the Saar Louis plant. Now that cries out for harmonisation. Same company, same car, same job, big difference in working time. And I think that's one of the areas that if we're going to stay with company bargaining, negotiators should perhaps be putting some more time and effort into. It requires better coordination between unions and better understanding between unions, and also the ability to plan long term and not allow multinational companies to threaten a particular country with disinvestment, which was the standard tactic that Ford and VW and any of the multinationals in the car industry would use. So there we are. Those are a few thoughts, a few tips to negotiators who might well be facing companies in pay negotiations. I hope you find them useful. There will be various online references for you to follow up, and anybody who's got any particular questions, either get back to me online or email me and I'll see what I can do.